Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here and particularly pleased to be part of this inaugural session of Poetry Live, and I'd like to thank Kitab Khana and the Indian Novels Collective, particularly Ashwini Kumar for curating this and Mansi Shetty for putting it all together. I think the reason so many of us have agreed and with such alacrity is the fact that this feels like some kind of virtual campfire, a chance to warm our hands at a collective campfire. And there is something about poetry, I think, particularly in times of uncertainty, that is, it's a role that is quite irreplaceable. It has to do with the fact that poetry responds spiritedly to uncertainty, but without ever resorting to the language of certainty. And that's what makes it so irreplaceable. I'd like to share with you some of the poems that I've turned to in recent times, poems that have helped me. And I'd like to start with Rumi. Rumi, of course, has a poem for every occasion. And this particular poem seems particularly apposite because it's a poem about being indoors, and it's also a poem about poetry. Of course, when Rumi speaks of the indoors, he speaks of it on another level altogether. And that's what makes it, I think, such an interesting poem. The tent. Outside, the freezing desert night. The other night, inside, grows warm, kindling. Let the landscape be covered with thorny crust. We have a soft garden in here. The continents are blasted, cities and little towns, everything become a scorched, blackened ball. The news we hear is full of grief for that future, but the real news inside here is no news at all. Listen to presences inside poems. Let them take you where they will. Follow those private hints and never leave the premises. It's a poem that could have been written today. And with that, I'd like to move to a poem by Jane Kenyon, the American poet. It's a lovely poem. It's a poem of thanksgiving for all the everyday, trifling, inconsequential moments that make up our lives, all the moments that are that much more precious because they won't last any more than we will otherwise. I got out of bed on two strong legs. It could have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birchwood. All morning I did the work I love. At night, at noon, I lay down with my mate. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. It might have been otherwise. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day just like this. But one day, I know it will be otherwise. And with that, I'd like to move to a couple of my own poems. This is a poem from my most recent collection, and it's called Memo. And I choose to read it because there are some memos to oneself that at least it helps me to read, particularly the first two lines of this poem. Memo. Reaching for the summit, but never forgetting. Coast. Reaching for the summit, but never forgetting. Coast. The melancholy of harbors by dusk. Women in summer dresses on the streets of Nice. The festive blaze of vendors on Juhu Beach. Evenings alive with hope and buttered corn. Never forgetting. never forgetting even for a moment. Mean sea level. And here's a poem to my mother, and it feels right to read this because here I am in this lockdown with my mother, very grateful to be with her here. And it's also a poem about being indoors and about looking through an entire world through a keyhole. So it in many ways does link to the predicament in which we find ourselves. When landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in the drawing room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue mulmul, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, the gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high-arched feet, better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know just when to incline her neck, just how to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of lacquered nails and baritone voices and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe, that mothers are women. And I'd like to conclude with a poem that is from my very first book. Interestingly enough, it's the poem that Ashwini has chosen to quote in his invitation. I was very struck by that because if there is a single poem that I would read for these times, it would probably be this particular poem, Prayer, from my very first book. Prayer. May things stay the way they are in the simplest place, you know. May the shuttered windows keep the air as cool as bottled jasmine. May you never forget to listen to the crumpled whisper of sheets that mold themselves to your sleeping form. May your pillows always be silvered with cat down and the muted percussion of a lover's breath. May the murmur of the wall clock continue to decree that your providence run 10 minutes slow. May nothing be disturbed in the simplest place you know, for it is here in the fetal hush that blueprints dissolve and poems begin, and faith spreads like the hum of crickets, faith in a time when maps shall fade, nostalgia cease, and the vigil end. And with that, I'd like to conclude and just want to say I'm delighted to be part of this again and looking forward to hearing Robin Gangom, old poet friend from Shillong. It's just wonderful the way technology makes all these gaps and distances absolutely irrelevant. Robin.